Welcome to the Tepper School of Business Multimedia Series. For more information on the Tepper School at Carnegie Mellon, please visit us at www.tepper.cmu.edu/multimedia. And now, here's your selected video.
We now have in the U.S. a situation where almost half of the population now does not pay federal income tax.
Yes.
Yet they vote. So
yes, they do.
How does something like that affect the effectiveness of capitalism and the political system?
I often say that Ronald Reagan ruined tax cutting for the Republican Party because he took so many people off the rolls when he reformed the tax system in 1986. He just eliminated it, so they don't care what the income tax is because they don't pay it. I mean, they may be interested in sales taxes and property taxes, but they're not very interested in income taxes because it doesn't have much to do with them. That weakened that argument from the right, whereas the left's argument that we need to tax more. You know, in economics, one of the fundamental lessons is that people who are deciding about resource allocation decide on consumption today or consumption tomorrow. That is, are they going to invest today to have more tomorrow, or are they going to take more today? That's what politics is about. It's about consumption today or consumption tomorrow. People who don't have much, some of them say, I would like to have more, and I want it to be given to me by some program for health care, for education, old age pensions, many things, food stamps. And there are people who say, well, I want my children to be better off than I am. So what I want to do is save and invest. And that's a constant struggle that goes on in the minds, in the voting booth of individuals forever. And will continue forever. No matter how wealthy we become, there will be people who feel I should have more, or I want my children to have more.
Speaking of budget deficits, Allan, you once worked for a U.S. president who said that deficits don't matter. Ronald Reagan once said that.
Yes.
So how would you respond to that today?
Well, I've had that question before. Dick Cheney I used to see Dick Cheney periodically when he was vice president, and he would repeat that. Reagan said, deficits don't matter. And I said, you left out the next sentence. And he said, what was that? I said, the sentence was, as long as the Japanese and Chinese buy the bonds, they're stopping.
Yeah. They're starting to diversify where they put their money.
Diversifying, right. And, you know, I've had a lot of contact, or at least a fair amount of contact from the Chinese. That's the first question they ask all the time. What's going to happen with the deficit? You know, what should we do about that?
So I'm still confused about what the right answer is. It's going to have to be higher taxes and less spending in some way, and a restructuring of the entitlement programs that we've already promised.
Yes, there has to be a restructuring of the entitlement program because they're unsustainable. And everybody who studies the problem and comes up with an honest answer understands that the entitlement programs, that's why the President Obama's group that came up with a proposal that he later didn't want to follow, they came up with that solution. Paul Ryan and the senator, Democratic senator from Oregon, have come up with that, recognized that. I mean, there's just a whole host of literature now, tons of it, saying it's unsustainable. Something has to be done.
If we don't deal with this issue in relatively short order, what can happen?
Well, eventually we'll get to a crisis, the way the Greeks got to a crisis, and then we'll have to deal with it. And, you know, we're not going to, I think it's very unlikely we're going to default on our debt. So, because that has just tremendous long-term consequences. So we'll deal with it. And there's the number of things you can do are very limited. You can devalue and wipe out some part of what we owe people that way, and we're doing that to a fairly well. You know, just to explain what that means, what I mean by that is when President Nixon took us out of the Bretton Woods system, there were 360 yen to the dollar. There are now 0.8. There were 4.25 Swiss francs to the dollar. There are now 0.9. So nearly 20% or thereabouts of the value as it remains. I mean, 80%, 75, 80% has been eliminated. So that cuts the value of what we have to pay because the debt is denominated in dollars. So that's one solution, but that isn't going to be a total solution. The only other solutions are cut spending, raise tax rates. And, you know, I'm very influenced by my friend George Shultz, who says when you negotiate politically, or even he was a long-time negotiator for Ford Motor Company, when you negotiate, if you get 100% of what you want, the other side gets nothing. Why would they agree?
So let me follow up on that. Inflation is something that you definitely think is coming soon.
I believe, yes. I don't believe that the brave words that the Fed puts out, that they have a solution to this problem. I've talked to a lot of the people who put out those words, and I just don't think they have an answer. So, you know, but ask yourself this very simple, direct question. In order to tighten, the Fed has to raise interest rates. When it starts to raise interest rates with $15 trillion worth of denominated debt, that means the interest payments go up by $150 billion for every 1%. So here's Congress trying to cut the budget deficit, and it's faced with the fact that as interest rates rise, $150 billion for every 1%. How long will that take? Well, the average maturity of the debt is about 3.5 years. So that tells you pretty soon you're going to see higher interest rates and bigger deficits. So that's like chasing your tail.
So as you look forward at the U.S., the economy, and where we stand now in March of 2012, I know it's difficult to make predictions, but perhaps you can give us a sense of what you think is going to happen over the next few years and what should happen. Are things as dire as they really seem to be at the moment?
I think we have many serious problems. We can't continue to import so much more than we export. We have a great opportunity to change that just by developing Marcellus Shale, which would cut down on the huge amount of oil that we and others import from the Middle East. That's a great advantage, which we've just more or less in the last few years have uncovered, and that's going to be a blessing for us if we're able to proceed and get gas. The price of gas in the United States, natural gas, is around $2 to $3, whereas in Europe it's much higher. So we're going to be an exporter. The United States will be a big exporter. So instead of importing oil, we're going to be exporting gas or liquefied gas, and that's going to change things dramatically. We also have to do something, of course, about our budget deficits and future budget deficits and our unfunded liabilities. And that's the big question for the country. In my book, I talk about how the Europeans from 1950, 1960 to 1980 closed the gap on American standards of living. They got to about 80% on average of our standard of living, which was a big step forward for them. Since that time, they've gone to the welfare state, and we have produced a much more dynamic economy. Over the next 25 years, they fell behind. Germany, France, Italy fell behind 1% a year on average, 25% over 25 years, maybe a little bit more if you compound it, so that the gap between our standard of living and theirs opened up. That's the choice we're going to make. We're going to make whether we want to follow them and have higher unemployment with more benefits, higher welfare state spending, more benefits, or whether we're going to have more growth and the benefits will come, but they'll come later and they'll be paid for out of the higher levels of income that we achieve. That's That's the big issue for us, and we'll see how the voters decide that. I mean, as I always emphasize, it's democratic capitalism. The public, in the end, decides the most important issues. How much do they want to tax, and how much they want to spend? One thing is certain: we're going to spend less because we have an unsustainable deficit. The question is, how much more are we going to tax? Any compromise, I believe, will involve some of each. The issue is, where are we going to put that division?
Well, thank you very much, Allan, for taking this time to talk with me today. The book is fantastic. I enjoyed reading it.
Thank you very much.
I'm sure many others will as well. So thank you very much for meeting with me today.
Thanks for doing this. I really enjoyed talking about it.
Thank you.